They told me I'd need a lawyer to survive that courtroom. What they didn't know was that I'd spent 8 years putting war criminals behind bars, and nothing my stepmother's attorney could throw at me would touch what I'd already survived. I walked in wearing my Army service uniform alone, and I watched the smirk spread across Diane's face before I'd even taken my seat. She thought she'd already won. She had no idea who she was about to face. By the end of that day, the smugness in her eyes would be gone, replaced by something closer to fear. I stepped through the heavy oak doors of the Fulton County Courthouse, still smelling like jet fuel. 9 hours earlier, I'd been standing on a tarmac at Fort Moore, my duffel bag over my shoulder, catching the first flight I could get after my father's attorney called and told me the hearing had been moved up. I hadn't slept. I hadn't changed out of uniform. There hadn't been time for either. My hands were steady, though years of courtrooms had taught me that much, if nothing else. Diane saw me first. She was seated at the plaintiff's table in a cream-colored suit, her hair freshly done, her nails the color of blood oranges. She looked exactly like what she was, a woman who had spent 30 years perfecting the art of looking innocent. When her eyes landed on me and then swept the empty space beside me, where a lawyer should have been standing, her mouth curved into that familiar, cutting little smile. "Couldn't even manage to bring representation," she said loud enough for the bailiff, the clerk, and half the gallery to hear. "I suppose you're going to lose today, then." I didn't answer her. I set my briefcase down on the defense table, squared it with the edge, and took my seat. Silence, I had learned long ago, unsettled people like Diane far more than any comeback ever could. She wanted a reaction. She wasn't going to get one. To understand how I ended up in that room, you have to understand what happened after my mother died. I was 19, home from my first year at West Point when the cancer finally took her. My father, Robert, was a good man who had built a modest logistics company into something substantial, but he had never learned how to be alone. 18 months later, he married Diane. At first, I told myself she made him happy. I was stationed overseas more often than not, building a career, and I let myself believe that distance was the only thing keeping me from my father, not her. But every time I came home, something had shifted a little further. My mother's photographs disappeared from the hallway. My childhood bedroom became a meditation room. Family dinners that once lasted for hours shrank to stiff 20-minute obligations where Diane steered every conversation back to herself. She was patient. I'll give her that. She never did anything so obvious that my father would notice, let alone object. She simply made herself indispensable, handling his medications, his schedule, his finances, while making me feel every single time I visited like a guest in a house I'd grown up in. By the time my father's heart problems worsened 2 years ago, Diane had positioned herself as his sole caretaker, and I had become in her carefully cultivated narrative, the distant daughter who only showed up when it was convenient. None of that had prepared me for the phone call 3 weeks ago. My father's longtime accountant, a quiet man named Walter who had known our family for over 20 years, reached out to warn me that Diane had filed papers requesting a court order to strip me of my authority as my father's healthcare proxy and power of attorney roles he had assigned to me himself, in writing before his health declined. She was claiming I had coerced him into changing his estate documents. She was claiming I was a danger to his well-being. The accusation was so absurd it took my breath away. I hadn't spoken to my father about his will in over a decade. I had never asked him for a single dollar. And yet, there it was in black and white in a civil complaint with my name on it, Melissa Grant accused of manipulating a sick elderly man for financial gain. Sitting in that courtroom, I let my eyes move once briefly to my father. Robert Grant sat in the second row, thinner than I remembered, his hands folded in his lap, refusing to meet my eyes. Diane had brought him, of course, a visual proof of her devotion. Though I noticed the way his shoulders curled inward, the way he seemed to be shrinking into his suit jacket rather than sitting in it. Judge Harold Bennett entered and the room rose. He was a tall man with silver hair and reading glasses perched low on his nose. And as the clerk read the case number aloud, I noted the way his gaze moved briefly across the room, pausing just for a moment on me. I couldn't tell if it was recognition or simple curiosity at the sight of a colonel's uniform in a family court. I filed the observation away and said nothing. Eric Lawson, Diane's attorney, rose first. He was smooth, expensively dressed, the kind of lawyer who had clearly never lost a case he considered beneath him. He opened by painting a picture of a devoted, loving stepmother who had sacrificed years of her own life caring for a man whose biological daughter had, in his words, chosen a military career over her own family. Diane nodded along with every sentence, dabbing at the corner of one dry eye with a folded tissue. When Eric finished, she leaned toward him and I heard her murmur, just loud enough for the words to reach me. "Today she's going to learn what a real courtroom looks like." I opened my legal pad, uncapped my pen, and began to write. I didn't look up, not yet. There would be time for that later, plenty of it. For now, I let her believe exactly what she wanted to believe, because the version of me that Diane thought she knew, the daughter who only knew how to take orders, was about to walk into a courtroom she understood nothing about. And by the time she realized her mistake, it would already be too late to undo it. Court recessed for 15 minutes before opening statements, and I used every second of it. I found a quiet corner of the hallway, pulled out my laptop, and opened the folder Walter had sent me 2 nights earlier. 3 years of financial records he'd quietly compiled after growing suspicious of the account activity he'd been asked to stop asking questions about. What I found in those pages made my stomach tighten in a way that had nothing to do with jet lag. Over the past 18 months, 4 separate accounts that had belonged solely to my father, accounts from before his marriage to Diane, protected by the prenuptial agreement she'd signed without complaint, had been slowly drained. Not in a single dramatic withdrawal that would raise flags, but in careful increments. 3,000 here, 5,000 there. A withdrawal timed just under the threshold that triggered bank reporting requirements. And alongside the missing money, 2 properties my father had owned outright, a lake house in North Georgia, and a small commercial building he'd rented to a hardware store for 20 years, had both been quietly sold within the last year, the proceeds routed through an LLC I didn't recognize. My father hadn't mentioned selling either property. Not once, not to me, not in any of our infrequent but genuine phone calls. I sat with that for a moment, feeling something old and familiar settle into my chest. Not rage exactly, but the particular focused clarity I used to feel walking into a tribunal, knowing a defendant had lied to my face and thought they'd gotten away with it. Diane wasn't the first person to underestimate what quiet, careful documentation could do to a case built on charm and confidence. She wouldn't be the last. She was, however, about to become the most personal. There is a version of my career that almost nobody in my family knows about. When people asked what I did in the Army, I usually said something vague: legal work, military law, enough to end the conversation before it started. It wasn't secrecy for its own sake. It was that the work itself didn't lend itself to dinner table conversation. For nearly 8 years as a judge advocate general officer, I prosecuted cases involving violations of the law of armed conflict service members and, in several instances, contractors who had crossed lines that could never be uncrossed. I had sat across tables from men who lied fluently, who wept on command, who had entire teams of expensive attorneys built around the singular goal of making the truth sound unreasonable. I had learned in rooms far colder than this one exactly how liars behave when they believe no one is paying close enough attention to catch them. Diane had never once asked me a real question about that part of my life. To her, I was simply the Army daughter, a woman who followed orders, filled out forms, and stayed out of the way. It was a convenient story, and I had never bothered to correct it. There had been no reason to. Until now. When the recess ended and we filed back into the courtroom, Eric Lawson rose with renewed confidence, clearly pleased with how the morning had gone. "Your Honor," he began, "my client has devoted the better part of a decade to caring for Robert Grant, while the defendant pursued a career that kept her thousands of miles away. We intend to show that Mrs. Grant's recent actions, however they may be characterized by the defense, were made entirely in Mr. Grant's best interest, by the one person who was actually present in his life." Diane's chin lifted slightly with pride at her attorney's words. She leaned back in her chair as though the case were already decided, glancing my way with an expression that dared me to object. "My client is confident," Eric continued, "that once the court reviews the full picture, it will become clear that Colonel Grant's absence from her father's daily life speaks louder than any legal argument she might attempt to make herself without proper counsel. There it was again, that pointed little dig, delivered smoothly enough to sound like professional commentary rather than schoolyard mockery. I kept my expression neutral and my pen moving across the legal pad. Diane couldn't resist adding her own commentary during the next break, catching me near the water fountain outside the courtroom. "You know," she said, tilting her head, "I actually feel sorry for you. Spending your whole career taking orders from other people, never really building anything of your own. Robert built an empire. I built a life around caring for him. What exactly did you build, Melissa?" I looked at her for a long moment. "You'd be surprised," I said quietly, and walked back into the courtroom before she could respond. That evening, back in the sterile quiet of my hotel room, exhaustion finally caught up with me, the kind that settles into your bones after 30 hours without real sleep. I was reviewing bank statements for the 4th time when my phone buzzed with an email notification. The sender's name stopped me cold. Captain Marcus Webb, a former paralegal who had worked under me on 2 of my most difficult prosecutions years earlier, now retired and living in Georgia. The subject line read, "Saw the news, I think I can help." I opened it with hands that were suddenly not quite steady. Marcus explained that a mutual acquaintance, the wife of a colleague from my old JAG office, had mentioned my name in connection with a family court case, and something about the details had caught his attention. As it turned out, Marcus had, through an entirely unrelated volunteer position with a local senior fraud prevention nonprofit, spent the last several months reviewing a series of suspicious property transfers in the exact county where my father lived. He believed cautiously, without overstating it, that some of what he'd seen might connect directly to the very transactions I'd just spent the night poring over. He offered if I wanted it to testify. I read the email 3 times before I set the phone down on the nightstand and allowed myself for the first time since stepping off that plane to exhale fully. Diane believed she was facing a daughter with no lawyer and no leverage. She had no idea that somewhere in the machinery of this case, the truth had already begun assembling its own witnesses. The courtroom felt colder the second morning, or maybe that was just my own nerves settling into something sharper. I arrived early before the gallery filled and spent 20 minutes arranging my documents in the precise order I would need them, a habit from years of court-martial proceedings, where a single misplaced exhibit could unravel an entire line of questioning. Order mattered. Preparation mattered. Diane's team was betting on the assumption that I had neither. Eric Lawson opened the day's proceedings with what I recognized immediately as a calculated strategy not to argue facts, but to erode my credibility before a single piece of evidence had been introduced. He rose, slowly buttoning his jacket with theatrical precision, and turned toward the judge with the practiced solemnity of a man who had given this same speech in a dozen other courtrooms. "Your Honor, I want to be direct with the court," he said. "Colonel Grant has chosen to represent herself in these proceedings. I understand that military law provides certain officers with legal training, but I would respectfully remind the court that military law and Georgia civil procedure are, in practice, 2 entirely different disciplines. My concern is that without proper counsel, Ms. Grant may find herself at a significant disadvantage, one that could prejudice the fair resolution of this matter." It was clever I'd give him that, framed as concern for fairness when its real purpose was to plant doubt in the judge's mind before I'd said a word. Diane, seated beside him, folded her hands and adopted an expression of practiced sympathy, as though she too were simply worried about my well-being. "Your Honor," I said, rising, "I appreciate my opposing counsel's concern for my legal education. I can assure the court I'm quite familiar with rules of evidence and procedure. I'd ask that we proceed on the merits of the case rather than speculation about my qualifications." Judge Bennett studied me for a moment over the rim of his glasses, something unreadable passing behind his eyes. "Noted," he said simply. "Mr. Lawson, let's proceed." Diane wasn't satisfied to let it go, though. During the next recess, she found a reason to walk past the defense table, pausing just long enough to lean down and murmur, "You really think that uniform is going to save you in here? This isn't the Army, sweetheart. Nobody salutes rank in a civil courtroom." I met her eyes without blinking. "I'm not asking anyone to salute me, Diane. I'm asking the court to look at the evidence." She straightened some of the confidence flickering, though she recovered quickly enough to offer a small dismissive laugh before walking away. I watched her go, noting not for the first time how much energy she spent trying to provoke a reaction out of me. People who were confident in their position rarely needed to work that hard to unsettle their opponent. Her need to get under my skin told me more about her case than any of her attorney's arguments had. The morning's testimony belonged to a financial advisor named Patricia Hoyt, whom Eric had retained to present a summary of the estate's current financial standing. She spoke in the confident, slightly condescending tone of someone who had rehearsed her testimony until it sounded natural, walking the court through a series of charts that painted Diane as a careful steward of my father's assets, managing his finances responsibly in the face of his declining health. I let her finish without interruption, taking notes, watching the way she avoided any specific mention of the 2 sold properties or the pattern of withdrawals I had spent the previous night mapping out. When Eric turned the witness over to me for cross-examination, I saw a flicker of surprise pass across several faces in the gallery, including the judges. I approached slowly, my questions deliberately simple at first. Ms. Hoyt, you testified that you've managed the Grant family's financial records for the past 18 months. Is that correct? That's correct. And in that time, were you aware of any properties being sold from Robert Grant's estate? A brief hesitation, almost imperceptible, but I'd spent years learning to catch exactly that kind of pause. There may have been a property or two, yes. Routine liquidation as part of estate simplification. Routine liquidation, I repeated. Can you tell the court who authorized those sales? Mrs. Grant is his primary caretaker and holder of a limited power of attorney for certain matters. A limited power of attorney, I said, letting the words sit in the air for a moment. Ms. Hoyt, do you have documentation showing my father's informed consent to those specific sales? Her eyes flicked toward Eric just briefly. I would need to review the file. Please do, I said. I'll wait. The silence that followed stretched longer than it should have, long enough that a few members of the gallery shifted in their seats. Eric rose to object, citing relevance, but Judge Bennett waved him down without much enthusiasm, his attention fixed on the witness stand. I didn't press further. I didn't need to. I had planted exactly the seed I wanted planted, and I could see it beginning to take root, not just in the judge's expression, but in the faint crease forming between Diane's carefully arched eyebrows. As the session neared its end, I rose once more, addressing the court directly. Your Honor, given the complexity of the financial questions raised today, I'd like to formally request the opportunity to personally examine the next witness, scheduled Mr. Robert Grant's longtime accountant, Walter Simmons, rather than have his testimony summarized through secondary sources. A ripple of surprise moved through the gallery. Eric opened his mouth to object, then closed it, apparently deciding against giving my request any more attention than it had already received. Judge Bennett considered me for a long moment, his pen tapping once against his legal pad. Request granted, he said. We'll reconvene tomorrow morning. Colonel Grant, I trust you'll be prepared. I will, Your Honor, I said, and for the first time since stepping into that courtroom, I saw something shift in Diane's expression. Not quite fear yet, but the first hairline crack in her certainty. The next morning, the courtroom filled faster than it had the previous 2 days. Word travels quickly in a small legal community, and apparently the story of a decorated Army officer representing herself against her stepmother's high-priced attorney had made its way through the courthouse gossip circuit overnight. I noticed a few unfamiliar faces in the gallery, clerks from other departments, a young reporter from the local paper Curiosity dressed up as Coincidence. I arrived early again, my uniform pressed, my documents organized in the same deliberate order. Walter Simmons was scheduled to testify first, and I had spent most of the previous night preparing questions that would walk him carefully through 18 months of financial records without giving Eric Lawson any opening to object on relevance. Precision mattered. I had learned long ago that the most damning testimony often came not from dramatic revelations, but from a slow, methodical accumulation of small, undeniable facts. Walter took the stand, looking exactly like what he was, a quiet, careful man in his 60s, who had spent his entire career keeping other people's financial secrets in order, and who clearly found the current situation deeply uncomfortable. I approached him gently, aware that a hostile tone would only make him more guarded. "Mr. Simmons, how long have you served as the Grant family's accountant?" 22 years? And in that time, would you say you were familiar with Robert Grant's typical financial habits and decision-making patterns?" "Very familiar. Robert has always been meticulous. He reviews every statement personally, always has." "Has that changed recently?" Walter glanced briefly at Diane before answering, his hands folding together on the witness stand. "In the last year and a half, yes. I began receiving instructions for transactions that Robert hadn't discussed with me directly, instructions that came through Mrs. Grant on his behalf." "Can you give the court an example? The sale of the property on Lake Burton?" "I handled the closing paperwork, but Robert never called me about it beforehand, which was unusual. When I mentioned it to him afterward, almost in passing, he seemed confused. He said he didn't remember discussing a sale." A murmur moved through the gallery. Eric rose immediately. "Objection, Your Honor, hearsay." Sustained as to the elder Mr. Grant's specific statement. Judge Bennett said, "But the witness may continue describing his own observations and professional concerns." I nodded and continued walking Walter through document after document, wire transfer authorizations bearing a signature that, when placed side by side with older documents from years prior, showed subtle but unmistakable differences. I had a forensic document examiner's preliminary report ready, not yet formally entered into evidence, but I let the comparison speak for itself as I displayed both signatures on the courtroom screen. "Mr. Simmons, in your professional experience, does this signature appear consistent with Robert Grant's established signature on file?" Walter studied the screen for a long moment. "Honestly, no. The pressure is different. The R and the G don't connect the same way they used to. I noticed it myself actually several months ago, but I assumed age or his declining health might account for it." "And did you raise that concern with anyone?" "I mentioned it to Mrs. Grant. She told me his hand had been shaking, more lately arthritis, and asked me not to trouble him with it." I let the silence stretch just long enough for the implication to settle before moving to my next line of questioning, walking Walter through the LLC that had received the proceeds from both property sales. The company, registered only 14 months earlier, listed a single managing member, D. Grant Holdings. Diane's name thinly disguised behind corporate paperwork, she had apparently assumed no one would think to investigate. By the time I finished my examination, the energy in the courtroom had shifted entirely. Eric attempted a brief redirect, trying to reframe Walter's testimony as speculation from an accountant unfamiliar with the nuances of estate planning, but the damage had been done. Judge Bennett, who had remained largely impassive through most of the previous 2 days, was now taking notes with visible attention, occasionally glancing toward Diane with an expression that had cooled considerably since Monday morning. During the lunch recess, I stepped outside for air and found Robert waiting near the courthouse steps alone, without Diane hovering beside him for once. He looked older than I remembered from our last visit, his shoulders drawn in his hands, trembling slightly as he reached for the railing. "Melissa," he said quietly, "can we talk?" I hesitated, unsure whether this was a genuine opening or another calculated move orchestrated by Diane. But something in his eyes, a rawness I hadn't seen in years, made me pause and sit beside him on the concrete bench. "I don't understand what's happening," he said, his voice unsteady. "Diane told me you were trying to take control of everything, that you'd forgotten about me the moment you left for the army. But watching you in there yesterday—" He trailed off, shaking his head slowly. "That's not what I remember of my daughter." I didn't answer right away. Years of cross-examinations had taught me the value of letting silence do the work sometimes. But this wasn't a courtroom, and this wasn't a witness. This was my father, fragile and uncertain, searching my face for something I wasn't sure I was ready to give him yet. "I never stopped loving you, Dad," I said finally. "But we can talk about that after this is over. Right now, I need you to trust the process. Can you do that?" He nodded slowly, his eyes glistening. "I want to believe you." "Then believe the evidence," I said gently, and stood as the bailiff called us back inside, leaving him with those words to sit with through whatever came next. When court reconvened after lunch, I felt the shift in the room the moment I walked back through the doors. Judge Bennett was already seated reviewing something in the case file with a focus that hadn't been there 2 days earlier. Diane sat rigid beside Eric, her earlier composure replaced by something tighter, more guarded. She had noticed her father's absence from her side during the recess, and I could see the question working behind her eyes, wondering what Robert and I had discussed, wondering how much ground she'd lost. Eric called his next witness a property appraiser named Gerald Finch, presumably hoping to redirect the court's attention away from the signature discrepancies and toward a narrative of routine, reasonable estate management. Finch testified competently enough about market values and standard liquidation practices, but I had done my homework the night before, cross-referencing every appraisal date against the actual closing documents. "Mr. Finch," I began once Eric had finished his direct examination. "You testified that you appraised the Lake Burton property in March of last year. Is that correct?" "Mind. That's correct. And the closing on that sale occurred in February, 1 month prior to your appraisal." He blinked, glancing down at his own paperwork as though checking whether he'd misremembered something. That doesn't sound right. Let me look." "Take your time," I said, watching him flip through pages with increasing unease. The courtroom had gone very quiet. "It appears," he finally admitted, "that there may have been some paperwork filed retroactively. I wasn't aware of that timeline discrepancy until just now." I didn't need to say anything further. The implication was clear enough: a sale that had happened first with an appraisal manufactured afterward to make the numbers look defensible. I moved on before Eric could recover his footing, walking Finch through 2 more properties, with similarly tangled timelines, each one chipping away further at the story Diane's team had spent 2 days constructing. By mid-afternoon, Judge Bennett called a brief recess to review several documents privately, and when the court reconvened, his tone had changed noticeably. Given the volume of financial irregularities presented today, he said, addressing both tables, "I'm ordering a full forensic audit of the Grant Estate's financial records over the past 24 months to be conducted by an independent court-appointed examiner. I want bank records, property transaction files, and any related LLC documentation submitted within 10 days. Eric rose immediately. "Your Honor, with respect, that timeline seems—" "10 days, Mr. Lawson," Judge Bennett said without looking up from his notes. "This court has heard enough today to warrant a closer look." I kept my expression carefully neutral, but inside something settled, the particular quiet satisfaction of watching a case built on assumption begin to buckle under the weight of documentation. Diane, beside her attorney, had gone very still, her hands folded so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had lost color. That evening I returned to my hotel room and found a voicemail waiting from Marcus Webb following up on his earlier email. When I called him back, his voice carried the same measured calm I remembered from our years working together. "I've been going through the property records more carefully," he said. "The LLC listed on those Lake Burton and commercial building sales D. Grant Holdings. It's not the first time that name's crossed my desk. There's a nearly identical pattern with 2 other elderly homeowners in the same county over the past 3 years. Same notary public witnessing the signatures on all of them. Same law office handling the closings." I sat down slowly on the edge of the hotel bed. "Are you saying this might not be the first time?" "I'm saying," Marcus said carefully, "that if the pattern holds, this could go well beyond a family dispute. I'd want to verify everything before saying more, but I think it's worth pulling in the notary's records as part of your document request tomorrow." I thanked him, my mind already racing through the implications, and spent the next 2 hours drafting a supplemental discovery request, naming the notary specifically along with a formal motion, asking the court to expand the forensic audit to include a review of any other transactions bearing her signature within the relevant time period. The following morning before court began, I filed the motion and watched Eric's expression shift as he read through it at the defense table, the practiced composure cracking just slightly at the edges. Diane leaned over to read it herself, and for the first time since I'd walked into that courtroom 4 days earlier, I watched real fear settle into her face, unmistakable and unrehearsed. Judge Bennett granted the motion without much hesitation, adding the notary's records to the scope of the ordered audit. As the morning session continued, Eric attempted to salvage what remained of his case, calling character witnesses to speak to Diane's devotion as a caretaker, neighbors, A hairdresser, a woman from her book club who tearfully described Diane's patience during Robert's health scares. It was a reasonable strategy in theory, an attempt to humanize his client before the financial evidence fully buried her. But character testimony, however heartfelt, couldn't answer the questions now sitting at the center of the case: who had signed those documents, who had authorized those sales, and why an 82-year-old notary's records suddenly connected 3 separate elderly homeowners to the same small, quietly aggressive LLC. As the session drew to a close, Judge Bennett set a date for the next hearing once the forensic audit results were complete. Diane left the courtroom that afternoon without her usual composed exit, walking quickly, her heels striking the marble floor in short, uneven steps, Eric trailing a few paces behind her, already speaking in the low, urgent tone of a man recalculating his strategy. I stayed behind for a moment, gathering my papers, aware that whatever came next would no longer be about winning an argument. It would be about how much further the truth extended, and how many other families Diane's carefully built house of paper had already touched. The forensic audit took 11 days instead of 10, and I spent every one of them at Fort Moore, splitting my attention between a training rotation I couldn't postpone and a phone that never seemed to stop buzzing with updates from the court-appointed examiner's office. When the report finally landed in my inbox, I read it standing in my quarters at nearly midnight, my exhaustion forgotten the moment I understood the full scope of what Marcus's instincts had uncovered. The audit confirmed everything I had suspected, and then went further than I had imagined. Over the past 3 years, D. Grant Holdings had been party to 6 property transactions, not 4 of them involving elderly homeowners, with no connection to my father, each case following an identical pattern. A trusted caretaker, or newly acquired power of attorney. A notary named Sandra Whitfield, who had witnessed every single signature in question. Signatures that a forensic document examiner now confirmed with a high degree of certainty showed evidence of tracing and simulation rather than genuine execution. And buried in the financial records, something I hadn't anticipated at all: a series of medical documents Diane had filed with our father's insurance provider 18 months earlier, requesting a formal cognitive evaluation for Robert. The evaluation had never actually been completed. Diane had canceled the follow-up appointment after the first session, and the preliminary notes from that single visit, which she had apparently never shown to another living soul, indicated the examining physician had found no significant cognitive impairment at all. She had been building a paper trail toward incapacitating him legally, just in case the financial maneuvering alone wasn't enough to secure everything she wanted. I called Walter first, then Marcus, confirming what I already knew needed to happen next. When court reconvened, I would need Robert himself to testify, not as a prop for Diane's narrative this time, but as a witness in his own right, speaking to his own state of mind, his own decisions, his own understanding of what had been done in his name without his knowledge. I drove to my father's house the evening before the hearing, the first time I had been back inside it in nearly 2 years. Diane wasn't there. Her attorney had apparently advised her to stay away from my father until the audit results were formally addressed in court, a small mercy that gave Robert and me the space we hadn't had in years. He answered the door himself, moving slower than I remembered, but his eyes were clearer than they'd been at the courthouse steps. We sat in the kitchen, the same kitchen where I'd eaten breakfast every morning of my childhood before my mother's photographs disappeared from the walls, and I walked him through the audit findings as gently as I could manage. I watched something in his face collapse as I described the canceled cognitive evaluation. The 6 property transactions, the LLC bearing initials, meant to look at a glance like nothing more than an innocent extension of the family name. She was going to have me declared incompetent, he said quietly, more statement than question. So none of it would matter what I said afterward. I don't know that for certain, I said. But the evidence suggests she was preparing for that possibility. He was quiet for a long time, staring at his own hands resting on the kitchen table. I signed those papers because I trusted her, Melissa. I thought I was protecting her, taking care of her the way I should have taken care of your mother longer than I got the chance to. I never imagined... His voice broke, and he pressed the back of his hand briefly against his mouth. I never imagined she was taking care of herself instead. I reached across the table and covered his hand with mine, an instinct older than any legal strategy, older than the distance that had grown between us over the years. "Will you testify tomorrow?" I asked. "Not for me. For yourself. So the truth is finally on the record, in your own words." He nodded slowly, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, I saw something steady return to his expression. Not the confidence of the businessman he had once been, but a quieter, more fragile resolve that felt somehow more honest than anything I'd seen from him in years. The next morning, Robert Grant took the witness stand for the first time in the proceedings, and the courtroom fell into a stillness I hadn't felt since the trial began. Eric attempted briefly to object to his own client's husband testifying against her interests, but Judge Bennett overruled him without hesitation, noting that Robert had every right to speak to his own competency and consent. I kept my questions simple, allowing my father to tell his own story in his own words, rather than shaping it through cross-examination technique. He described signing documents he didn't fully understand, trusting explanations that turned out to be incomplete or false, the growing isolation from friends and family that Diane had engineered so gradually he hadn't recognized it happening until it was nearly complete. "Melissa never asked me for anything," he said at one point, his voice steady despite the tears gathering in his eyes. "Not once in her whole life. Everything I have I wanted to give to my children freely. What's happened these past few years, the sales, the accounts, all of it, none of that was ever what I wanted. I want the court to know that clearly. My daughter did not manipulate me. If anything, I failed her by not seeing what was happening in my own home." Diane sat frozen at the plaintiff's table throughout his entire testimony, her carefully composed mask finally completely gone. When Robert stepped down from the stand, he didn't return to his seat beside her. He walked instead toward the gallery toward me and sat down in the row directly behind the defense table, close enough that I could hear him breathing unsteadily behind me for the remainder of the session. Judge Bennett called for closing arguments the following week, once the final pieces of the forensic audit had been entered into the official record. The courtroom that morning felt different than it had on any of the previous days. Quieter, heavier, the way a room settles once everyone in it already senses how something is going to end. Diane arrived without Eric, walking confidently ahead of her this time. She walked in slowly, her eyes fixed somewhere in the middle distance, wearing the same cream-colored suit she'd worn on the first day, though it no longer seemed to fit her the same way. Eric attempted a closing argument that tried to salvage what little remained of the case, suggesting the financial irregularities could be attributed to poor record-keeping and the understandable confusion of managing an aging spouse's affairs during a stressful period. It was, I understood, the only argument he had left to make, and even he seemed to know how little weight it would carry against 6 fraudulent property transactions, a fabricated appraisal timeline, a cancelled cognitive evaluation buried in insurance records, and a father who had sat on the witness stand and stated plainly that none of it had ever reflected his actual wishes. When it was my turn, I rose and walked to the center of the courtroom without my notes. I had spent 8 years learning that the strongest closing arguments were rarely the longest ones. "Your Honor," I began, "this case was brought against me on the claim that I manipulated my father, that I was absent from his life, that I sought control over assets I had never once asked to control. The evidence entered over these past weeks tells a very different story. It tells the story of a man who was isolated from his family, whose signature was reproduced without his knowledge, whose medical records were quietly manipulated to build a case for his own incompetency, all so that his estate could be systematically transferred out of his control. I am not asking this court to punish anyone out of anger. I am asking this court to restore what was taken, my father's voice, his authority over his own life, and the truth that has been buried under 18 months of carefully constructed paperwork." I sat down. Diane did not look at me. She stared instead at the table in front of her, her hands folded so tightly together that the tendons stood out along the backs of them. Judge Bennett took a recess before delivering his ruling, nearly 45 minutes that stretched long enough for the gallery to thin and refill twice over. When he finally returned to the bench, the room fell silent almost before the bailiff called for order. "This court has reviewed the full record in this matter." He began, his voice measured and deliberate, including the forensic audit findings, the testimony of Walter Simmons, the property appraisal discrepancies, the notary records connecting multiple transactions across several elderly homeowners, and the direct testimony of Robert Grant regarding his own understanding and consent. Based on the totality of this evidence, this court finds no credible basis for the plaintiff's claims against the defendant, Colonel Melissa Grant. The plaintiff's request to revoke Ms. Grant's power of attorney and healthcare proxy designations is denied in full. Those designations, executed freely by Robert Grant prior to the onset of any undue influence, remain in full legal effect. He paused, glancing briefly toward Diane before continuing. Furthermore, given the substantial evidence of fraudulent financial activity, forged signatures, and potentially manipulated medical documentation uncovered during this proceeding, this court is referring the complete case file to the District Attorney's Office for Criminal Investigation, along with a formal request that the State Bar review Ms. Whitfield's notary commission. Any additional victims identified through that investigation will be entitled to pursue separate civil remedies. The gavel came down once quiet and final, and the sound seemed to echo far longer than it should have. Diane didn't move for several seconds, staring straight ahead as though she hadn't fully absorbed what had just been said. Then slowly, she rose, gathered her coat without looking at Eric, or at Robert, or at me, and walked out of the courtroom alone, her heels striking the marble floor, in that same short, uneven rhythm I had heard days earlier, except now there was no one hurrying beside her. I stayed seated a moment longer, feeling the strange, quiet weight of a case finally closing before I felt a hand rest gently on my shoulder. I turned to find my father standing behind me, his eyes red-rimmed but steady, his hand trembling slightly as it stayed there against my shoulder. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "for everything I didn't see, for every year I let slip by while you were out there fighting for other families, and I couldn't even manage to protect my own daughter from being pushed out of mine." "You don't have to apologize, Dad," I said, standing to face him fully. "You're here now, that's what matters." He pulled me into an embrace that felt, for the first time in longer than either of us wanted to admit, entirely unguarded. No performance, no audience, nothing between us but two people who had finally found their way back to something honest. Outside the courthouse, the afternoon light was sharp and clean, and as we walked down the steps together, slower than my usual pace but exactly matched to his, I felt something settle in my chest that had been unsettled for the better part of 2 decades. A young second lieutenant, apparently recognizing the uniform or perhaps just the quiet authority in how I carried myself, stopped on the steps and offered a crisp salute. "Have a good day, Colonel," he said. I returned the salute properly out of habit and respect, and beside me I felt my father straighten just slightly with something that looked unmistakably like pride. Melissa's story reminds us that justice sometimes takes time, patience, and someone brave enough to stand up to those who underestimate them. I'd love to know what you thought of this ending. Leave a comment below, and let me know where you're watching from. We have powerful emotional stories like this one to share with you every single day, so make sure to subscribe so you never miss a moment like this. Let's keep this journey going together.